Hello. Let's see. Hopefully we'll get some viewers on this. I know I haven't done a live stream or a video in quite a while, but I wanted to hop on here and just help myself think out loud about some stuff I've been working on. And in this case, the topic is basically the 1940s conflicts and controversies between the Nouvelle Theologie or Ressourcement branch of that and the Thomists of the day, and how their discussions back and forth still have some implications for theology today. While we wait for more people to show up, hopefully, I'd like to take this opportunity just to, thanks, Jacob, appreciate it. Just remind people that I do have a locals community where I've been doing more work than on YouTube. And that is pinned in the live stream, the live chat comments, as well as hopefully in the description. Sometimes when I put links in the description, they don't actually work as hyperlinks. I don't know why. But I did pin it in the live chat comment section as well. I'm trying to get to 50 plus supporters on locals because that will unlock my ability to upload more videos, because right now I'm limited to 5 gigabytes per month, and that goes pretty quickly. You can only really do a few videos a month. Plus, currently I can do 5 30-minute live streams, but if I get up to 50 supporters, then I can do, I believe it's 10 or 15, I forget now, 10 or 15 like hour and a half live streams. So I'd like to get that number up. And so just to be clear up front, my YouTube channel and my locals community are not connected with my full-time employment. I try not to do too much overlap between the two, but I do try to do things that help me in that. So they're things that still pertain to my work or my own continued self-education, and that I can draw from in things I might do, but they're not connected in any way to my full-time employment directly. So, but I do try to do things on there that either are just complementary to it or could help me in the long run do other work. So for instance, yesterday I just posted my last of, I believe it was 13 videos, 13 or 14 on this book, Henri de Lubac's Catholicism, Christ and the Common Destiny of Man, the original French subtitle being The Social Aspects of Dogma. I just posted the final video on that yesterday on locals. So for those of you who become supporters, you can view all of those videos. And so I encourage you to consider becoming a supporter on locals. But this particular video is, the impetus for it came from my reading of this recent publication by John Kerwin and my friend, Dr. Matthew Minard, who edited and translated this book, The Thomistic Response to the Nouvelle Theologie, concerning the truth of dogma and the nature of theology. And I do encourage people to pick this book up. It's a great read. And it's really given me a lot of food for thought. And basically, there's a very good, like 85 or so page introduction written by Kerwin and Minard. And then it basically translates the most important articles written by Dominican Thomists. It's broken up into 2 parts. The first part is the Toulouse response, so the Dominicans coming out of Toulouse, and then the Roman response, which is really Garrigou-Lagrange and his articles. So there's, I believe, 16 total, you can see them here, 16 articles pertaining to this discussion that were published in here. and they're really worth the read. And they I particularly so far am impressed with the writing style of Michel Labordette. I really like the way he lays things out and the way he discusses things. He's does a great job of addressing the issues, trying, being very open about what his concerns are, but also trying to enter into a fraternal dialogue where he's saying, look, here's my concerns. If I've misunderstood you, please explain so that I can understand better. Maybe I'm not understanding you guys, but from what I'm reading, these are my concerns. And unfortunately, the Dominican response met with a snarky reply, anonymously written, but we know now it was written by Dulubak himself, where he basically says I'm using my own words here, but chasing ghosts, and that they don't push the agenda that he is claiming that they do, or that the Dominicans were claiming that they were. And so it's basically the Fourvière Jesuits and what they were doing, including a book by Bouillard on conversion and grace and St. Thomas Aquinas. And the final chapter of that's where it really sparks the controversy. But there's some other stuff by Danielu and others, and the Theologie series published by the Fourvière Jesuits, as well as the Sources Chrétiens. And the Sources Chrétiens were basically French translations of patristic texts with commentary. And it wasn't the publication of the patristic texts, but particularly the verbiage of some of the comments made, some of the commentary in those volumes that really was of concern to the Dominican Thomists of the time. So I just kind of I don't really have like a prepared lecture or anything on this, but I just want to kind of share my thoughts. And so the interest of full disclosure, give you a little bit of my background and my theological leanings. Like most Orthodox Catholics growing up, you just sort of know that Thomas Aquinas is upheld as basically the greatest theologian of the church's history. That's what led me to choose him as my confirmation saint. Always had a deep love of Aquinas. In my formal studies, I had some training in Aquinas, but I don't think nearly adequately enough. I think he wasn't given enough space in most official courses that I took. I did have the benefit of taking a 2-semester metaphysics course with the Thomist Monsignor John Whipple. Happy Sunday, Haley. And I did take a moral theology course from the Thomist Father Romano Cesario, and then I took a doctoral seminar course on Aquinas on the Incarnation and Passion. So I really loved all 3 of those courses, and it only increased my love for St. Thomas Aquinas and his theology. I'm glad you were able to make the live stream too, Jeff. So that's part of my background. Now, since I already mentioned that I don't think Aquinas was covered enough in my academic theology courses, there's other theologians that were particularly beneficial to me. I took a doctoral seminar course on the thought of St. Bonaventure, who, of course, was at the University of Paris, overlapping his time there with St. Thomas Aquinas, and whom St. Thomas Aquinas also had great respect and admiration for. And then, to an extent, Henri de Lubac. I read his, I think the first book I read of his was probably The Splendor of the Church, which I really loved. Later on, I did read his books on nature and grace and did a paper on that, and I thought there was a lot of good content there. I read Corpus Mysticum, which was an interesting historical study. And I did some work with von Balthasar, but not his like big multi-volume works. I read more of his shorter works, his smaller books, and got some beneficial reading out of that. But I've never really studied his theology in depth, so I only know some of his shorter, less technical works. Um, Obviously, those of you guys who know me, the biggest influence on me and the figure that was the most prominent in my not only my education but in my writing and publishing has been Joseph Ratzinger slash Pope Benedict XVI. I just pretty much fell in love with his writing and his works. And so, what's interesting about that? Thank you, Christine. What's interesting about that is my studies initially in Thomism and in the Communio school, which of course, Communio was a international network of journals founded by de Lubac, von Balthasar Ratzinger, and others, um, was somewhat independent of each other. So I just appreciated both of those schools, if you can call them that, independently. And it was only kind of later in my work that I started to become more aware of the conflicts in the early to mid 20th century between the Ressourcement camp and the Thomists of that era. And so I'm not alone in this. I think, I saw an interview that Dr. Matthew Ramage gave recently where he kind of had the similar experience where we didn't really see a conflict between those two schools. And so when I was learning more about the sometimes vitriol that the camps had for one another, or at least intense debates with one another, it was sort of surprising to me and confusing because I considered both to be orthodox approaches to theology. Yeah, a little bit different in method, you might say. We'll get into that a little bit later, but more or less all solid works worth reading fruitfully. And so I get a little bit confused. I did take a course on the Nouvelle Theologie on the doctoral level, which was really good because it was taught by Dr. Christopher Ruddy, and he had a very balanced approach where he encouraged the students not to take a black hat, white hat approach and say, well, these guys were the good guys, these guys were the bad guys, but challenged us to consider where each side had good points and where each side may have had weaknesses, and to try to have a balanced approach to that. So he made us read some of the Thomist stuff, such as Gertrude Lagrange's famous article, often translated as "Where's the New Theology Leading Us?" Or in Meinard's book, it's translated as "Where's the New Theology Headed?" And he makes some good points in there, and I knew that from the beginning. Now, reading this Thomistic Response book, it was somewhat confusing in some ways because a lot of the things the Dominicans were concerned about are things that I share concerns about, and mostly quotes taken from like Bouillard especially, but even Danielu had some comments, and it's just confusing to me because what I know of on Balthasar, de Lubac, and Ratzinger. Now, Ratzinger's not involved in this because this was a French argument taking place while he was still rather young, so he had nothing really to do with this directly. But I would think that they would agree with a lot of the criticisms that the Dominicans gave, and yet we know that de Lubac wrote the article defending the Nouvelle Theologie side or the Ressourcement side, but his response basically suggests that he doesn't really disagree with the Thomists, but he doesn't think that what they're saying really applies to their work, the Jesuit work. But it's hard to ignore the fact that the Dominicans give quotes from some of the works that they were talking about, and with very clearly, I think, problematic arguments. So it seems pretty clear to me that there were different camps, even within the Nouvelle Theologie Ressourcement group, where they had some commonalities, but very variegated, you know, distinct in some of the particulars. So, for instance, one of the big challenges that Dominicans were concerned about was this push to basically unseat Thomism and Aristotelianism and to emphasize a dialogue between Catholic theology and modern philosophy based on the fact that modern people don't think in scholastic or Aristotelian categories anymore. And so the idea is they're not capable of understanding theology when we put it in those terms. So let's dialogue with modern philosophies. Um, Now, my position would be, well, okay, yes, it's important to study modern philosophy so we know how modern people think, but it's not the case that all philosophies are equally compatible with the Catholic faith, especially when you consider that a lot of the modern philosophies were written explicitly against the perennial philosophy of, Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism from the Catholic tradition. And so they contained fundamental errors, especially in rejection of metaphysics and realist epistemology, metaphysical epistemology, that make them fundamentally incompatible. You can't, if you're denying the ability of the human mind to know the truth about reality, um, so basically denying a realist epistemology, then that's incompatible with the Catholic faith. So you can't simply translate the Catholic faith from one philosophical system into any other. It doesn't work like that. And so I think the Dominicans were right on that front. And despite his defense of himself and his fellow Jesuits, I think de Lubac would actually agree with that. I mean, there's a great quote, I can't remember exactly where it's from, but where he says that his big concern is not that people nowadays do not have a good enough grasp of modern thought, but that rather they don't have a good enough grasp of the tradition. Um, and I, now he was influenced by Maurice Blondel, but unfortunately, I don't know much about Blondel. But I know that he and Garrigou had, extended back and forths, and so I'm not really sure because that seems to be the linchpin: is how much did Blondel affect de Lubac, and that's something that I need to, really um, investigate myself. What are we talking about? We're talking about, as the title of this video should suggest, the mostly taking place in the 1940s controversies between the Nouvelle Theologie, or the Ressourcement branch of Nouvelle Theologie, and the Dominican Thomists. So mostly the Fourvière Jesuits and the Toulouse and Roman Dominicans, about the nature of theology and the truth of dogma and that sort of thing. So that's the basic, and then trying to discuss how those have implications for us today. So basically, I agree with the Dominicans on that front. I think I think you have to be very careful in trying to say that the Aristotelian Neoplatonic philosophies of the church's tradition is somehow just accidental entirely. Like, for instance, there's a statement made by Bouillard where he claims that when Aquinas adopted Aristotelian philosophy as a means of explicating his theology, he was simply going along with the craze of the day. And I think that's just absurd. I think that Aquinas adopted Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophies insofar as he thought they got things right. The same thing with St. Bonaventure, who's also a Neoplatonizing Aristotelian. And that's why Bonaventure is even more willing to criticize Aristotle, actually, when he thinks he gets things wrong. but still uses them. And so it's not just a wholesale adoption, but a discerning retrieval of that classical Greek thought insofar as it seems to do a good job of expressing the truth of things. And so I don't think, all philosophies are made equal. That's just patently not true. And unfortunately, Bouillard at times seems to suggest, at least by implication, that philosophies are just like languages and you can just translate concepts from one system to the other. And one of his most concerning comments that the Dominicans took issue with was his he basically says that if you can't just change one concept, you have to change all of the concepts. That as the mind evolves, all of the concepts have to evolve because the concepts in a given system are mutually illuminating. Now, I understand what he's saying. Concepts in philosophical systems are often interrelated, and you can't simply bracket out certain ones. But I think he's misunderstanding the nature of the meaning of the concept of concept. I don't think he understands that the concept is not the same thing as term. Concept is the actual object of the intellect and what it is grasping, and then it's using terms to express those. So, I don't, if you're changing the concepts, you're changing what you're talking about. You can't simply transpose things from one system to another as if they're equivalents, because then you would just be talking about changes in terminology with the same concepts behind the terminology, like synonyms. And what's interesting to me is that in his work, as far as I can tell, like he gives an example, which is that of formal causation, and he says that Trent did not mean to canonize Aristotelian categories when it adopts the language of formal causality in regards to the sacraments, to the effect of grace on the person. That it only meant to say that it's not something that's just extrinsically adjudicated to the person, but that it actually affects the person within intrinsically. But what's interesting to me is he doesn't actually give an example of how any other system has how you can translate that teaching into a different system. So the fact that he himself couldn't give an adequate example of, like, oh, well, for instance, in Thomistic language, it's this, but if you want to use this other philosophy language, it would be that. And so that we could see what he's talking about to make sense of it. It remains rather meta and vague. And that tells me that even he couldn't really do what he was suggesting successfully. So anyway, I tend to agree with the Thomists on that point, because I think the Catholic faith requires some sort of realist metaphysics and epistemology. Now, maybe you could say that there's some wiggle room within that, like on certain points of metaphysics. Do you agree with Bonaventure or do you agree with Aquinas? Understanding that there's a lot of commonality between them already. Even Scotus, we're talking about, they're all scholastics with a Neoplatonic Aristotelian background. So there's some overlap. But it seems to me like, just like dogma sets the boundaries of theological dialogue, I think the church also has boundaries with regards to what philosophies we can hold. That's why it can condemn modernism and the philosophies associated with it. It's why it can condemn Marxism, because it has fundamental errors in its very system at the very base of it, and therefore it's not compatible with Catholic thought. Now, you could also argue that's also true of Aristotelianism on certain points, that Aristotle had fallacious ideas about certain metaphysical concepts. So those two, it can be purified. But on the whole, it's much more closer to what we receive from Revelation, and is therefore adequate. Now, the the Dominicans make a good point in this regard, and something that I think Ratzinger himself agrees with, which is that it's no, as Ratzinger says, it was no accident that Christianity and Hellenism, Greek philosophy, merged into a unity, or had a fruitful interchange very early on. He thinks that's providential. Um, so I tend to agree with that. The Dominicans make a similar point. They're like, you know, God has spoken to us through Hebrew and Greek thought, which is in the Bible, which is something that Ratzinger himself also says. Like, these metaphysical categories are already in the New Testament, especially in John's Gospel. So you can't just act like this is something completely accidental. And so I like the Dominicans' point on that, it's not arbitrary that God used that language. Now, there can be problems. I don't really want to get into all that. There can be certain elements of, modes of expression in the Bible that are not being asserted as such. But what the Bible is teaching, what is in the New Testament, does presuppose certain things. And so we can't, in that sense, just adopt any philosophy whatsoever. And so I think it's a mistake to say, oh, well, because as Bouillard said, he made the claim that a theology that is not contemporary would be a false theology. And he tried to clarify that later in an article after he received some pushback, in saying that, well, he wasn't saying that it was right at one point and now it's wrong. And that wasn't the point he's trying to make. But in the original work itself, which is the final chapter of his dissertation, it's just very poorly expressed if that's not what he meant. So I agree wholeheartedly with the Dominicans' critique of some elements of the Ressourcement or Nouvelle Théologie group back then. But the one place I would give pushback on some of the Thomistic responses to this was their very narrow definition of what theology is. They, on the whole, they seem to suggest that theology is a science and only a science. And by science, they mean sure and certain knowledge. Now, in this case, we're not talking about dogma, because all Orthodox Catholic theologians must accept that. It is knowledge, it's a divinely revealed knowledge, and therefore it's sure and certain because of, who it comes from, which is the motive of credibility through faith. We assent to revelation because of the one who reveals it. But what it means in a theological certainty would be coming to sure and certain conclusions drawn from the dogmas, that we can either know other truths or develop other aspects of what is revealed more explicitly. I'm not denying that theology does include that there is scientific theology that can attain to that. But saying that that's all that theology is where I would have a problem, because I don't think anything that falls short of sure and certain logical necessity argumentation is therefore not theological. For one thing, I think you'd end up having to say that in the patristic era, there basically was no theology because it wasn't yet scholastic. I think that's a problem. But there is a place where some of the Dominicans want to suggest that, oh, yeah, it's fine to do these other things. It's fine to do these other reflections and to, have this more poetic language or this more rational reflection that doesn't attain to the level of demonstrable science, meaning like necessary argumentation. And that's fine, you can do that, but then it's not theology. And I think that pushes it too far. Then you're basically saying Ratzinger isn't a theologian, or the church fathers weren't really theologians. And I think it can get very dangerous. because I don't know that we can logically prove by necessity all of the things that we can actually know. And maybe there needs to be a discussion about what it means to know and to what extent things are certain. But one thing that the Communio school and the Thomists have in common is this dedication to the understanding the faith as a whole and how the different mysteries are mutually illuminating. You can understand the church in light of the Trinity. You can understand the church in light of Christology, and vice versa. And so the different revealed truths actually shed light on one another. But how much of that is provable versus it's something that you see when you shine the lights on one another? And maybe that's where I think some of the clarification we need to come from on the side of the Dominicans, because it also seems to just completely get rid of any notion of the category of theological opinion. Because if you're saying theology is science, meaning sure and certain necessary knowledge, or knowledge gained through necessary conclusions, through deductive reasoning, then, if that's the case, then anything that's an opinion couldn't be theology. And I just don't think that that's a valid way to think about it. Now, they do, like, for instance, Garrigou-Lagrange has a very interesting schema, like diagram, talking about theology and its parts. And he includes within that the positive theology. Now, what is positive theology? Positive theology basically is what the Ressourcement group was talking about. It's delving into scriptures and the tradition and the patristic texts and the high scholastic texts and retrieving the data from there. So positive theology is kind of like historical and biblical theology. You're doing a study of what has been said about different theological topics in scripture and the theological tradition. So in that sense, he kind of sees that as like a precursor to the higher speculative theology, which is more of the scientific. But if that's the case, then to what now? Labradette has a good article in here on some of this stuff about positive theology and speculative theology. Now, you could argue that there's a certain science to the positive theology insofar as you're digging through it, you can come to a greater knowledge about what was said, and therefore certainty about what was said, without attaining to the certainty that what was said was true. So you'd have a different category for what you mean by knowledge. Like, well, we know that St. Basil said this, or we know that St. Gregory the Great said that, which is different than saying, well, we know they were correct on this or that. At least logically, you could say that. So maybe there's some wiggle room there, but I'm just not convinced that everything in theology is reducible to scientific knowledge in a strict philosophical sense of demonstration through logical necessity. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. And that's where I think I would offer some pushback. And let me just check the comments here and see where people are at. And then maybe I'll continue with some further thoughts afterwards. Let's see. Nope, it's doing things I don't want to do. Hold on. All right. So there's a question about Thomism and or Thomism versus. So Thomism versus Ressourcement or Nouvelle Théologie. Now, Nouvelle Théologie is a French term meaning new theology, and it was coined pejoratively against some of the French thinkers of the day, like mostly, some Dominicans, but mostly Jesuits. They're calling it a new theology. De Lubac rejected the term, claimed that his theology was actually older than the Neo-Thomist theology, so how could his be new? But some of the stuff being done in those camps were new. So, but I don't like the term because it tends to lump in people that were radically different from one another. So I prefer Ressourcement, which is a subgroup that was basically pushing for a return to the sources, hence Ressourcement, which would be Scripture, the Church Fathers, and the high scholastics like Aquinas and Bonaventure. And so it was basically in reaction to what they would call Neo-Thomism, which I guess it's a good time to get into this topic. Is Neo-Thomism a good category or not? Some people hate it. I think it's generally warranted for this reason. If you look at the scholastics themselves, like Bonaventure and Aquinas, they were basically doing what the Ressourcement crowd was calling for in the 20th century, which is becoming a master of the sacred page, learning the church fathers, studying the tradition, and then you get into your speculative theology. Then you get into your, writing your tomes on theological topics after you've done the positive theology of scripture, patristic, and scholastic and magisterial texts. So that's what the high scholastics were themselves doing. I mean, a big part of their work, they had to become masters of the sacred page. So they had to be masters of the Bible primarily, first and foremost. And then the Sentences of Peter Lombard was the textbook, which was basically a collection of sayings of the church fathers on different topics and juxtapose them together. And so the question became, well, what do you do when different church fathers seem to, have either contrary or seemingly contradictory comments about ideas? How do you resolve the question? And so the scholastics basically would juxtapose those different concepts, the different approaches to a given theological topic that they found in the church fathers, and then try to resolve the question in light of scripture and in light of speculative thought and philosophy, and say, well, in this case, this is how I would answer the question. And there was actually a lot of diversity. That's why you had one of the major genres within the scholastic, and by this I mean around 12th, 13th centuries, was the disputed questions, because you would have different scholastics taking different positions on different questions. They might agree on some and disagree on others. And that was perfectly legitimate, and it was part of theology to have this discourse where you would disagree with one another, and you would have to present your opponent's argument accurately. It had to be a steel man, it couldn't be a straw man, and you had to systematically resolve the question knowledgeably. What ends up happening in the later scholastic period, and then in the renewal of scholasticism in the 19th and 20th centuries, was, well, in the intervening centuries, you had what's called the commentatorial tradition, where you had, when, for instance, the Summa of Aquinas became more or less one of the major sources, then people started writing commentaries not on the Sentences of Peter Lombard, but on the Summa, which is fine. But what that meant was you started having theology become a series of commentaries on the work of Aquinas. But then they weren't actually doing what Aquinas himself was doing. They weren't going back to scriptures and to the church fathers and doing what Aquinas did, but rather just using that work as its starting point and then commenting on commentaries and developing a commentatorial tradition where you basically are going through the various commentaries after Aquinas, following those and tweaking things here or there and adding your own thoughts and insights and trying to develop it. Now, I don't think that that's a bad thing, and I think that's perfectly legitimate to do. But the concern of the Ressourcement crowd was that you're allowing the commentatorial tradition to overshadow Aquinas himself, because people were starting to basically study manuals or commentaries on Aquinas rather than even reading Aquinas' works directly. Or they weren't really reading the fathers anymore, and they weren't really studying scripture as much anymore. Like, they were so fixated on commenting on commentaries that they were basically built mostly upon secondary sources and not the primary sources. And that's why I would say, at least right now, I tend to think that neo-scholasticism or neo-Thomism is an apt description, because it's not clear to me that the neo-Thomists were doing the same thing as Aquinas. So I think, I think there's a case to be made that what Ressourcement was asking for was, hey, let's do theology the way the scholastics themselves did theology. So they weren't anti-scholastic in that sense. They were somewhat anti-neo-scholastic, because they thought that it was weighing down theology, being dominated by commentaries on commentaries, and getting into the weeds, because it's, as the commentaries develop and develop, you're getting more and more details and these minute arguments about very specific things, but then you're sort of missing the big picture. Now, that's whether that criticism is accurate or not. You could dispute it. But basically, there was this dispute between the Thomists and the Nouvelle Theologie, and so that's what we're discussing. I know that was a very long answer. I was quite surprised just how much. I don't like this. I guess I need to start using StreamYard again, because I can't highlight on YouTube directly and put people's comments up. Anyway, City of the Immaculata writes, I was quite surprised just how much Bonaventure uses Aristotle, considering the reputation. Yes, well, and that's part of the reason for this book by Kerwin and Minard, is that very often in theological education, you get very overly simplistic presentations of the history of things. It's just a common thing, and basically things become memes, and they get passed on from professors to students, and then their students in the future, and they can often be misleading, because when you don't know the actual history of things and the specific texts involved, and you're just conveying this idea, you can get wrong impressions. And one of them is the idea that Bonaventure's an Augustinian Platonist and Aquinas is an Aristotelian, and that's it. Well, that's just patently not the case. They're both Neoplatonizing Aristotelians. I mean, a huge part of Aquinas' theology and philosophy was the notion of participation, which is Neoplatonic. And Bonaventure uses Aristotle directly and approvingly in many, many instances. So it's not this cut and dry. As a matter of fact, I mean, Bonaventure's epistemology is basically a uniting of an Augustinian divine illumination theory and an Aristotelian knowledge through the senses theory. And the argument's actually been made that Aquinas himself also holds a form of divine illumination, even if it's different than Bonaventure's. But yeah, things get overly simplified all the time. Jeff, exactly. For Thomas Bonaventure, Aristotle captures the truths of natural philosophy. That's an important distinction, and it's why so many get them wrong. Yep, exactly. Okay. All right, let's see. What are you it keeps bringing up these, when I click on something, it's bringing up menus, and it's blocking what I'm trying to read. What do you think about the line of Scotus who believed as Christians we should actually begin with metaphysics before natural philosophy? I don't think Scotus says this, but it makes you think. I actually haven't studied much of Scotus, so I really can't say. But yeah, that's a good question. Let's see. Yeah, where is it? All right, let's see. Yeah, Jeff holds that Benedict XVI instantiates the Achem Aristotelian golden mean between scientia and poetica. Yeah, he does a great job of balancing the two. I agree with that. There's a lot of things I could say about that that I'm going to avoid for now, but I think the affect for the Communio school in particular, affective modes of expression are actually not only legitimate but desirable in theology. That there should be an aspect of the heart involved. I've been criticized sometimes for being too affective in my writing, and I think it's a hypercriticism because their whole notion of beauty, you know, the way you express things should be beautiful, and they don't have to just be logical categories and strict philosophical argumentation. Theology is also a form of love, and it's perfectly legitimate to have a poetic aspect to your theological treatises, I believe. And I think even Garrigue would agree with that in certain contexts. I don't know if you spent time with Newman's Grammar of Assent, but it's worthwhile, especially related to how we assent to propositions of faith and certainty. Yeah, I have. I took a course called Revelation and Faith, and we used that book. It's been a long time, though. I mean, we're talking, I don't even want to know how many years ago it was, but probably a decade and a half or more. I just vaguely, unfortunately, it wasn't a good class, even though we used some good texts. I mean, I basically remember notional assent, real assent, illative, but I couldn't delineate for you what those mean. So it's something I need to go back and reread. I didn't think the professor did a great job of presenting the material, but maybe I also maybe it was just my own, like I should have read more carefully is probably maybe the more accurate reality. The Logos Project. Hi, Dom. Could you also say that if theology is merely science, it takes away the communal aspect of theology, which would be essential to theology, i.e. theology is not done individually but ecclesially? Not necessarily, because just like in the hard sciences, I mean, this is one of the complaints about scientists that have done work for the government is the government's tendency to do over compartmentalization, where very often for scientific breakthroughs to happen, you have to be sharing ideas with one another before the eureka moment happens, that it's through the scientific dialogue. I think so, even in scientific enterprises, including philosophical, there can be a communal aspect, especially if you understand that the purpose of even coming to a scientific conclusion would be to share it with others. So I don't necessarily think it takes away from that. Especially if you understand that communal aspect being across time, you are still drawing upon some sort of tradition and furthering the conclusions down the line. So it doesn't necessarily have to, but I think it narrows it too much and equates. I don't have a problem with saying that there is a component of theology that is scientific. I used to actually, I remember as an undergrad, I was mad because I had a background in science. I originally was a pre-veterinary medicine and biology major with a minor in chemistry. And when I switched my major to theology, I was upset that my degree was going to be a BA because I was like, no, theology is a science. And to some extent, I still hold that. But I mean, even in the hard sciences, not everything is sure and certain knowledge. And that's where I think I have a problem with saying it's only a science. If by science you mean only necessary conclusions drawn through rational deduction, to where it's proven the way that a mathematical theorem would be proven and therefore beyond doubt. And, I know the Thomists push back and say, well, just because people can doubt things that are certain, it's not the fact that it can be subjectively doubtful where it's objectively not, like the principle of non-contradiction. But I still think it's too narrow of a definition to say that anything that's not a sure and certain conclusion, because I think in theology, because so much of it is mystical, and that's actually something Gary Lagrange was big on, was mystery. So much of it is prayerful and mystical contemplation that if that is going to inform your theology, you can't just your fruit of your prayer and your contemplation with the divine word you're going to have eureka moments where you see things you didn't see before that you might not be able to prove in an absolute logical sense, but it's finding a way to convey that to others to help them see what you saw, I think is still theology, even if you can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt through logical necessity that that is the case. And I think so there's room, I think, for knowledge that is perceived without being proven, if I may put it that way. But it's something that I'd like to hear more Thomists talk about to help me with this, because maybe I'm just missing something in their definition of science. But it seems to me they have a very restricted view, and that's what concerns me. Um, all right, Neo-Thomism is too broad. Well, to some extent, yeah. I mean, Tracy Rowland has a work that I forget how many. There's like 7 or so different, even contemporary schools of Thomism now that have different approaches to things. Yeah. Yes, I do agree with that, Dom. That theology is always a dialogue with God, His Word, and with other theologians. Why do theology if the church seemed to have settled all the important questions? Well, I don't necessarily agree that they have. The church has. I mean, if you look at the history of theology and the church and its statements and teachings, it's constantly developing, because new questions arise in light of old questions, and you have to figure out how to answer the new question in light of the tradition, and basically which answer to this question actually fits in with what we already know. And I think that's an ongoing thing. And it's also the case that you need to do theology, because if people stop doing theology, how are you going to communicate the theological tradition to subsequent generations? You need people keeping it alive. It's not like, well, Aquinas wrote the Summa, we're all done. From now on, we just read that, and no one else thinks about these things. Let's just repeat what he said. I don't think that would be a good thing at all. And I think that's just proven in history. I mean, I think, and the way people convey the same ideas can be somewhat different. So again, the concepts might be the same, but the modes of expression can actually improve. That's why I think people like Ratzinger, as just one example, is really good at responding to or presenting things in a way that gives you a new insight into the same questions that we've been dealing with. And also because the questions of each era are different. I mean, the challenges we're facing from the culture are different now than they were 50 years ago, are different now than they were 100 years ago, are different now than they were 800 years ago. And so you're constantly, the missionary activity of the church to convert the nations requires this constant engagement with the questions of the day and the themes and responding to those things. Look at ethics. I mean, if anything, I think theology has had to develop in moral theology more than almost any other, because of just the advent of technology, and especially in the biomedical realm. Well, you have to do ethics in light of other aspects of theology as well. And so one, you have to study theology to know what this theological tradition is. And then you have to constantly be thinking about things. Plus, you don't only do certain sciences merely for some practical effect, right? You are, as a speculative science, it's not primarily practical. I mean, it's not for the sake necessarily of some action, but the individual, and this is something that Labradette, I think, does a good job of pointing out, that yes, you can encounter in scholasticism a certain laziness, as he says, where it's too sure of itself. Thomism sometimes thinks that it already has all the answers and merely goes into a mode of repeating what's already been said. And he thinks that's wrong. One, because he thinks it can often actually be lazy, because he thinks it's more important for the Thomist of any era to think through the questions along with Thomas and the commentators. so that you're not just, oh, what did he say? Okay, now let me repeat it. But you're literally thinking through and trying to grasp it and then formulate your understanding of it. And so it's always a personal dimension. And that's something you have to work through. It's not just a matter of cut and paste. It's you're entering into the conversation and you're absorbing it and you're thinking about it, and then you're trying to convey that to others. And there's always value in that, I think. And I think it would be very problematic if we stopped doing that. Let's see. Yeah. Where to go? I lost where I was at. See, Bonaventure's overlooked distinctions of the modes of theology help here. Agreed. The very divine creative act is word utterance, and therefore dialogic. Imago Dei, human being is the being that is discourse. Yes, that's at the heart of Ratzinger's theology of the person. The difference out of France and Italy versus Holland and Germany is huge. Bonaventure says there's three modes: symbolic, which is settled, academic, argued by theologians, and mystical, done by the saints. Yeah, good point. All right. DeWong says, I came late, so I don't know if you addressed this, but have the Ressourcement been able to develop a good structure of catechesis formation like the manualists? Good question. In some ways, I would argue that given that Ratzinger was the chief architect of the Catechism project, that yes. Because some people argue whether or not Communio school and Ratzinger in particular are Ressourcement or not, but I put him in that camp because his theology is highly influenced by Scripture and the Church Fathers and St. Bonaventure. So that is Ressourcement to me. Yes, theology on one's knees. That's right. But to their credit, the Dominicans say the same thing. So that's not unique to the Communio school. That's another point of agreement, I believe. Did I miss a question? Can you give me an example? Okay, I'm not sure. I guess it's about the church hasn't settled yet. Well, in moral theology, there's still certain questions that are open. But also, it's not a matter of, I think here's the problem. I think sometimes we reduce theology to, here's a question, here's the answer. Oh, well, the church already settled this. No, it settles disputes. So but not the whole theology is not merely settling disputes, right? That's part of it, and that's part of the role of the magisterium to set the boundaries. But you can have different theologies, quote unquote, that are not contradictory with one another, but are complementary. And so you might have someone write a book on Christology or ecclesiology that's going to highlight different aspects in light of other mysteries in a slightly different way than someone else might. And the person can have insights into how these things relate to one another in ways that maybe other people missed or haven't expounded. And the church might not settle those things, but it doesn't need to. So theology is not merely coming to the definitive one sentence answer to any given question. That is not the whole of theology. So I guess that's part of what I would say there. You can look at the manualists, look at if you want to read Cardinal Muller's volumes on dogmatic theology, or Nicola and his volume on dogmatic theology, or the recent one by Father Gagliardi. There's going to be some overlap, but each book is going to be different. They're not going to be word for word the same. And there's value in reading different, the way that the chapters are laid out, the way that things are explained in relation to one another. There's going to be complementarity there. And so one author is going to present it in a way that another author differs from the way another author presented it. And you can fruitfully read all of them and get an even better picture. So I guess I'd say that theology isn't just about settling, here's a question, here's the answer, and that's it. That's part of theology, but it's not the whole of it, if that makes sense. All right. I thought reading and studying theology was mostly for the clergy. There seems to be too much danger in laymen writing and reading about the holy topics. It was true that in prior eras, most theology was done by religious and clergy, although some of them would also be monks who are not ordained, so they wouldn't be clergy, because just because you're a religious brother does not make you clergy. There's still been lay theologians throughout time. And I think nowadays there's much more lay people doing theology, but so in other words, they're not priests, they're not bishops, but they still are studying theology officially. So for instance, I have 3 ecclesiastical degrees, right? So my degrees are sanctioned by the church. I have a doctorate in sacred theology, in systematic theology. So it's an ecclesiastical degree. I don't think there's some danger in a layperson doing sacred theology just because they're a layperson. As a matter of fact, I would venture to say that some lay theologians are better theologians than some clergy. So in other words, just because someone's a priest doesn't make them a better theologian. So I do think it can be dangerous for uneducated people who think they know more about theology than they do, just spouting off on social media all the time. And I've already criticized that in the past. But no, I don't think it's inherently dangerous for a layperson to do theology. Now, going back to Duong's question about structure of catechesis formation, yeah, I think they've influenced catechesis and formation, like I said, through the catechism itself, but also in some of their works. But I actually do think, I mean, catechesis, I think the catechism is actually pretty brilliant. It doesn't need a whole lot of improvement. But I would like to see not the catechesis part, but theological formation. I think we do need a renewal in Catholic theological education. That I actually thought about writing an article somewhere, I don't know where, asking should we return to the manuals, and it would be kind of a yes and no kind of answer. But I think there's actually value in having textbooks, and I think the Dominicans were right about that as well. Now, even Garrigou-Lagrange, though, was critical of the manuals of his day. He thought a lot of them were bad. So, but I think there is actually something to be said for you in your early studies of theology. Textbooks are a good thing, and as someone who studied the sciences before I studied theology, we all had textbooks. Like when I took organic chemistry, there's an organic chemistry textbook that distills the fundamental principles for that science that you need to know in order to do the work. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to have textbooks. And I was actually surprised when I started teaching theology at universities that there weren't really many good textbooks out there. I was actually kind of surprised by that. So I actually ended up using Frank Sheed's Theology for Beginners and Bonaventure's Breviloquium as 2 of my main sources, and then sections from the Summa, and assigned those for an Intro to Theology class that I taught for that very reason. Um, Now, so Father Gagliardi recently published it's over 1,000 pages long, and there's a foreword by Cardinal Muller, um, a single volume dogmatic theology. So that's getting closer to Emmanuel. I'd like to see more work like that. Need to have Dr. DeClue talk with Dr. Minard on this. I have. Me and Dr. Minard have conversed several times over the years. I plan to talk to him again soon, maybe tomorrow. Um, so we're in we used to email each other very regularly. Sometimes we text, sometimes we have phone calls. So I do talk about this stuff with him. Is it 19 different types that Roland counts? Jeez. Hey, PX, or should I say Rokai or anyway, if you don't mind, because I can't remember where she delineates that. If you could put that in the chat for me, I'd appreciate that because I'm wanting to find it and I couldn't remember where she actually lists them and talks about them. Great to see you work or dialogue with Dr. Jared Goff. He's a top Bonaventurean theologian, and Bonaventure's distinctions of the three most literally. Okay, I thought Goff was more of a Scotist. I know some people say that Scotus perfects Bonaventure. I'm not convinced of that, but I do know more about Bonaventure than I do about Scotus. He, though, has opened me up. I used to just not like Scotus because he overshadowed Bonaventure, and I liked Bonaventure so much. But I've never really studied Scotus in depth. So, but I've watched some of his work, and I've been intrigued by it. So I actually would like to learn more from Dr. Goff on Scotus. But is he more of a Bonaventurean or more of a Scotus? Because I thought he was more of a Scotus, but I could be wrong. Yeah, I agree with that. City of Immaculata. I'm probably way behind the chat here. Oh, the Immaculate Conception we defined it. I think there's a long way. Yeah. St. Thomas More comes to mind. Confessor was a layman. Yeah, St. Maximus the Confessor. Good point. Catherine of Siena, doctor, was only a third order lay. Dr. Kluber, theologian, then Father Martin or Cardinal Sukovich. I appreciate the compliment, Haley, and that will be change my mind. That's funny. That's all I'll say about that. I like that phrasing. Instead, saying such and such is a bad priest, bishop, I will just say Dr. Kluber, minor, etc., are better than ex-priest. There you go. Inspirational man, Dr. Yes, Dr. Minard has really benefited me personally. I've learned a lot from him. And I'm very grateful for him in this book and his other work, sort of helping us realize how poorly treated the Dominicans were, unfortunately, when they were. The thing that I get angry along with him on behalf of the Dominican Thomists, even though I like de Lubac and people like that, because for crying out loud, you can't declare that they were the furthest thing away from a heretic you could get. So if if these other people are allowed to spout off however they want, golly, you can't kick the Dominicans out. Their school's out of the academy. They have more of a right to be there than anybody else. So as much as I am for broadening the tradition and not having theology merely be Aquinas and his commentators, that hey, let's reread the Greek fathers and hey, maybe we can learn something from Bonaventure. Like, let's broaden our theological education, all for that. But that doesn't mean throwing out the entire commentatorial tradition in the Dominican Thomists. Like, you have more of a right to exist than a lot of other people that have been allowed to do rather poor work in theology. No, I have not read Abba Isn't Daddy. I have not, but it's a very intriguing title. Culture in the Thomist tradition. Let's see. Okay, he's a Bonaventurean who believes Scotus is compatible with. His book is on. Oh, interesting. I haven't actually read his book. Caritas in Primo, a study of St. Bonaventure on disputed questions of the Trinity. Oh, that could be interesting. I am very amenable to the Primacy of Charity. And Bonaventure's book on the disputed questions on the mystery of the Trinity is really good. I really thoroughly enjoyed reading that book. All right. So, any other questions or comments? While I wait to see if there's any more, just a reminder that I do have a locals community. I've pinned the link in the comments on the live chat, and there should be a link in the description, but I can't check it right now to see if it worked. Sometimes when I put things in the comment or in the description, the hyperlinks don't work. I don't know why. What am I working on in terms of the book? You're talking about the Benedict XVI book. Not sure how much I can say right now, but it's moving along well. So I'm mostly done right now. It's still going through different design phases, and then so like the layout, I think it's on the second or third iteration. I think they're working on the third, and then eventually I'll have a chance to, look through it again before it gets finalized. I'm not writing a book on the Eucharist, so I'm not sure what that's a reference to. Okay, the link works. That's good. But anyway, consider becoming supporters on locals. I just completed yesterday my final, I think it's like 13 or 14 videos on de Lubach's book Catholicism. See, I mentioned on writing that a few YouTube ago. A book on the Eucharist? I don't remember talking about writing a book on the Eucharist. The Ratzinger book, yeah. No, I mean, I'm working on some other projects right now. I might try to write a second book on Ratzinger's Theology of Divine Revelation, loosely based on my dissertation. Write a book on the Eucharist? I don't remember saying that. Maybe it was an idea of writing a book on, this could be, maybe I'd made a comment about, I had at one point been thinking about writing a book on Eucharistic ecclesiology, the Eucharistic understanding of the church, and bringing into dialogue like Ratzinger and like John Zazula on the Eucharist and primacy and the thought of Teilhard, which is not Teilhard. That's a different person. Tillard. And so I thought about combining, because I did work on Zazulus and Ratzinger on that. I thought, well, maybe I can combine that with my article on Teilhard, and then I could maybe write a book on Eucharistic ecclesiology. But so it would be a Eucharistic understanding of the church. So maybe that's why I was confused. Maybe that's what I was talking about. All right, let's see. I'm reading Bonaventure's Triple Way, a sort of follow-up to his Itinerarium. It's absolutely beautiful piece of scholastic mystical work. Yeah, I mean, I love St. Bonaventure. As a matter of fact, all right, ignore the mess. I didn't clean up before I did this. See that little super puppy baby boy right here? That's my dog, Bonaventure. That's his name. The fact that my family let me name him Bonaventure is a blessing. I wasn't sure I was going to get away with doing that, but I did. So that's my dog's name is Bonaventure. Yeah, look at him. He's an F1B Golden Doodle. Hi, puppy. Who's my puppy? Yeah. Write on why people should hate Communio theologians. The book would have a title, 100 blank. 100 blank pages, a la Michael Knowles. Yeah, that's funny. Be a bestseller. Probably sell more of those than my Benedict book. Good point. Yeah, it probably would have been a harder sell. Yeah, I call him my super puppy baby boy. He's my what's my other? I have he's this dog has more pet names than any other dog I've met. My sweet pea, call him that too. From I guess Sweet Pea was the baby from Popeye. By the way, if you haven't seen it, I when I was a kid, I loved the Popeye movie starring Robin Williams. I thought that was a great movie. Um, all right, any other comments or questions? Or if people had enough after an hour and 15 minutes. You're welcome, Jeff. Happy to do it. It's overdue. I've been thinking about writing something on this topic, and so sometimes it helps me just to think out loud. And so I thought, all right, well, let me just ramble a bit on these, and maybe some ideas will come to mind. So, all right, well, thank you all. Appreciate you spending time with me on this Sunday. And by the way, we've started going to an ordinariate parish. It's about 40-minute drive for us, but it's very much worth it. Love it. Great liturgy, great community. And yeah, thank you, City. Appreciate it. And yeah, God bless you all. Appreciate it. Have a good rest of your evening. God bless.